to introduce our first presenter, who is going to address animal breeding and water quality. He's a former state attorney general and district attorney, having been involved in some of Oklahoma's highest profile and most complex criminal and civil litigation. He brings more than 30 years of legal experience in practice areas including administrative law, case settlement, commercial litigation, government law, and white-collar crime. He now practices law with Gable Gottwald's firm. Please join me in welcoming Drew Edmondson.
Johnny is a joker, he's a bird, a very funny joker, he's a bird.
I'm not sure about that. Thank you, Chris, for that very kind introduction. Louisa, I have to say I was a little surprised when you announced that there was grass on the stage. Our Attorney General is suing the state of Colorado to try to keep that out. That apparently the litigation is not over. I'm very honored to have been invited to visit with you all this morning about water quality in particular and the concentrated animal feeding operations that exist in the state of Oklahoma. Just by way of background, I went the first 18 years of my life with my mother telling me I could not have a dog. And I've gone the last 47 years of my life with my wife telling me that I could not have a dog. We did have a succession of cats. We had Mosby and Allie, which was short for Countess Alucard, which is Dracula spelled backwards, and then Bally, and then most recently Fritz. We are currently catless, so if there are some kittens around here, I may have to take a look before I leave. But I do love animals. We kind of adopted neighbor dogs when I was growing up and enjoyed their company. When I was district attorney in Muskogee, we didn't have a lot to do with the environment or the enforcement of environmental regulations, but we did have a lot to do with the enforcement of criminal statutes against the mistreatment of animals. And I started to say pleased. It was a sad opportunity, but I was glad that I was there to do something about it when we had cases of people mistreating by neglect farm animals and allowing them to starve nearly to death, and of necessity had to take custody of those animals and provide for their proper care and treatment. And one case that we had that I will never forget was a case of some young people mistreating a dog and a cat and then recording the sounds that they made as they were being mistreated. And that case, which we filed as a felony, and we ended up sending those young people to jail, that case was my awakening to the fact that there exists across this nation a vast network of people who are very interested in the welfare of animals. I got more mail because of the publicity surrounding that case than I got on any high-profile murder case or bank robbery or anything else that I handled during the 10 years that I was district attorney in Muskogee. And it was people like you who dedicate your lives to making sure that animals are well treated, that make a difference in the lives of so many animals across this nation. Had a little different perspective when I became Attorney General. I was elected in 1994 and took office in 1995, and all of a sudden did have a broader gauge of responsibility and jurisdiction involving animals, their treatment, and their impact on the environment. At one of the first staff meetings that I had in 1995, I said, I'm tired about always reading in the newspaper about how the state of Oklahoma is the defendant in litigation. And the Attorney General's office is defending the state of Oklahoma, defending the Wildlife Department, defending the Department of Environmental Quality when it gets sued, that I think we ought to be the plaintiff more often, that we ought to seek out areas where the state needs to be more active and be involved in those cases. The first arena where we got involved was in, they were concentrated animal feeding operations, but they were hog farms, mostly out in northwestern Oklahoma. And I'm assuming that there are a lot of people in this room who know the dangers of that kind of a concentrated animal feeding operation. The waste from those operations are placed in lagoons, which is, it's not like the Blue Lagoon in the movie. These lagoons are not at all pleasant things. They are even more unpleasant when they are not properly lined, and the waste from those lagoons is allowed to seep into the water table and start affecting people's wells in the vicinity of those operations. It is also not a pleasant thing when those lagoons breach and the waste is allowed to run off into neighboring streams and pollute the water supply for communities and certainly for local farms and ranches. There's also an odor involved with those operations, and I'm telling you that as a fact, having been there and having observed it. And I have to do that because the legislature passed a law in the state of Oklahoma that said if a hog farm was permitted, the odor from that farm cannot be considered a nuisance. They literally passed a law that said hog waste does not stink. I had a question posed to the Attorney General in the form of an Attorney General opinion request wanting to know whether that statute was constitutional. And we did our research on it, and what we determined was that there was a provision in the Oklahoma Constitution that allowed, prevented a taking without due compensation. And our opinion said the statute, which would have prevented a lawsuit because of a nuisance, was constitutional only because a neighboring landowner had a cause of action under the Oklahoma Constitution to prevent the taking without due compensation. We found the Attorney General opinion process to be a good vehicle for addressing some of these problems. We issued an Attorney General's opinion that said that a pig improvement corporation or a seaboard corporation cannot satisfy the public notice permitting requirement by having a meeting in the high school gymnasium. That each landowner in the vicinity that would be impacted by such an operation, whether it be his water or the quality of the air, has an individual due process right to a hearing to determine what the impact would be on his particular location. Because what we find now that was alluded to in some of the graphs that you saw in the opening segment is that 74% of all the poultry in the world is produced in factory farms. 43% of all the beef, 50% of all the pork, and 68% of all the eggs are produced in factory farm type operations. In the United States alone, four companies, these are not the same four companies, but four companies control 80% of the cattle that's produced in this country, 73% of the sheep, 60% of the pigs, and 50% of all chickens that are produced in this country are controlled by just four companies. So we started issuing some opinions. We issued an opinion that said the Oklahoma Water Resource Board could consider waste by pollution in determining whether the granting of a permit to take water served a beneficial use. Theretofore, the Oklahoma Water Resource Board says we can't consider what they're going to do with the water. All we can consider is whether there's sufficient water available, and if there is, we grant the permit. Now, the Oklahoma Water Resource Board sadly went to the legislature in a following session and asked for legislation to reverse that. They asked for legislation to say that they could not consider waste by pollution in granting a water permit. We issued an Attorney General's opinion saying that I already said that, individual due process hearing. That was on the basis of an Attorney General's opinion. We also went to court to represent the Bethel Baptist Church up in Beaver County because of the impact a proposed hog farm would have on their quality of life. The question was whether they were an outdoor recreational facility, and we had to introduce testimony that they did indeed allow the children attending Sunday school to play outdoors. They had playground equipment, and they did qualify for the prohibition under that statute. Those things that we were able to do through the Water Resource Board, through the Attorney General opinion process, and through litigation did have an impact on the quality of those hog operations in northwestern Oklahoma. They're still there, but the linings of the lagoons are more secure. There are more safeguards against breach into the waters, and the adjoining landowners have more rights to protest or to have a constructive taking and receive compensation for that. We had a more difficult task to face on the concentrated poultry operations in northwestern Arkansas and northeastern Oklahoma. The methods of producing chickens in this country, as was indicated by the graph, have changed dramatically in the last half century. This is no longer what we saw in the opening scenes of The Wizard of Oz, with Dorothy out scattering seed on the ground for the chickens to eat, and then they roost at night and they go in the morning and take eggs. That's simply not the way it's done. The average poultry house today has upwards of 30,000 birds in it, 30,000. And they try to turn over 3 to 4 crops of birds in a year. So that's 90 to 120,000 birds in a single house. And most poultry operations have upwards of 10 houses at a time, 10 to 20. So you have a number of houses with a huge number of birds generating what we euphemistically refer to as poultry litter. Now, the poultry litter was gathered up and usually put in stacks like hay and ultimately spread on the land. And what we have to understand is where most of this was happening in northeastern Oklahoma was in the Illinois River watershed, which was a scenic river. It still is a designated scenic river for the state of Oklahoma. It includes the Illinois River and Flint Creek and Barren Fork and the tributaries of those like Peach Eater Creek. Those streams, when I first saw them, back in the 50s, when my father took me to the Illinois for float trips and things of that nature, and in the 60s, when I would take my very young children to the Illinois River, in those days was crystal clear. No matter what the depth was, you could see the bottom. Ed Fite, who has been the director of the Oklahoma Scenic Rivers Commission for the last 30 years, talked about dropping a cap gun into the Illinois River, seeing it there on the bottom and telling his father he wanted to go in and get it. And his father said, "You can't, it's 30 foot deep right there." But he could see it clearly on the bottom of the river. Tenkiller, into which the Illinois River watershed flows, was a destination site for scuba divers because of its clarity. It was crystal clear and beautiful. back in the 1960s and into the 1970s, until the massive poultry operations began in northwestern Arkansas and northeastern Oklahoma. The amount of waste generated by those operations, by a single poultry farm as I described it, no, by all the poultry farms in that area, create the same amount of phosphorus in the waste as a community in excess of 10 million people, several times the population of the state of Oklahoma. And if you can imagine, the method of disposing of that waste was surface application, ostensibly as fertilizer. So if you can imagine taking the combined waste of a community of 10.7 million, and instead of running it through a very extensive, expensive, and elaborate sewage system into a sewage treatment plant, instead of doing that, we're going to take the waste of 10.7 million people and simply spread it on the land. There would be a hue and cry, the likes of which you've never heard before, but that is precisely what we're doing with the poultry industry today. And it creates environmental problems. And the basic math of that is that poultry waste has roughly 1-to-1 ratio of nitrogen and phosphorus, 1-to-1. But the plant needs are roughly 8-to-1 nitrogen over phosphorus. So if you put down enough poultry litter to meet the nitrogen needs of that farmer, you're putting down 8 times as much phosphorus as those plants can absorb. The ultimate, inevitable result of that is runoff into the creeks and the streams and the rivers and the lake. And that is precisely what has been happening over the last 30 to 40 years in northeastern Oklahoma and northwestern Arkansas. At that point in time, the phosphorus does just as effective a job as a fertilizer in the water as it did on the land, and it creates algae growth. Algae growth in huge amounts, and algae sucks the oxygen out of the water. It changes the biosphere. Some fish can live in it and some can't. You end up with more frogs and snakes than you end up with wide-mouthed bass and trout. And it changes tin killer, which is no longer clear. As a matter of fact, tin killer today in the summer months is 60% oxygen dead. The same as the Chesapeake Bay from the massive poultry operations in Maryland and Delaware and Virginia. The Chesapeake Bay is 40% oxygen dead. It is a much larger reservoir. That is an inescapable chemical fact. And to my way of thinking, that makes the surface application of poultry waste as a method of disposal simply untenable. It cannot happen. So we entered into negotiations with the poultry industry, with the communities, and with the state of Arkansas to try to do something about it. We were very successful in terms of municipalities. In December 2004, as I recall, we reached an agreement, and communities like Tahlequah on our side and Siloam Springs and Fayetteville, they started spending millions of dollars to upgrade their facilities to meet Oklahoma's standard of 0.037 phosphorus milligrams per liter, or 1 part per million as it comes out of the pipe. We could do that because it was point source pollution. And there's a difference between point source pollution, which you can track and measure and prove, and non-point source pollution, which results from runoff from the land, which is what happens when you spread poultry waste out on the land. A much more difficult thing to prove. We settled with the communities. We reached agreement with the state of Arkansas, but poultry walked away from the table. And we ended up having to sue them. That case went on for years. It was finally completed in January 2010, and Judge Gregory Frizzell in the Northern District Federal Court has yet to rule on it from January of 2010. We all know from the book of Genesis that we were granted dominion as human beings over the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And with that grant of dominion came a charge of good stewardship. I would submit that we have failed in that charge. We have failed in our stewardship of the earth, and we have failed in our stewardship of those animals. The conclusion that I reached as a district attorney in Muskogee, that you can tell an awful lot about a person by how he treats his dog or his cat or his horse or his cow, is even more true in the case of factory farming. That you can tell a lot about a person or an operation or a company by how they treat their animals and their environment. Ezekiel tells us in chapter 34, "Woe to the shepherds of Israel who only take care of themselves. Should not the shepherds take care of the flock? You have ruled them harshly and brutally." And Proverbs chapter 12, verse 10 says, "A righteous man regardeth the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel." You know, from Gandhi to the Bible, we have all the admonitions that we need to tell us how we should treat the animals of the earth and how we should treat the earth itself, because one truly has an impact on the other. How we treat the animals in chicken houses, how we treat the animals in hog farms, and how we treat the animals in cattle operations tells a lot about how we regard not only those animals, but the earth itself. And I'm so pleased that there is in this room a cadre of dedicated people who will take this message back to their legislature, back to their Congress, back to their courts, and make sure that this is a land where we treat our animals kindly and in turn benefit the earth. Thank you very much.